Hello, my name is Lesley Atherton, and this is my short story called Caves. The walls were moving closer in, and her gritted eyes were drifting closed, despite the fear tugging at her. How could she be passing out, yet, on the inside where it matters, be screaming to be mobile and to be set free? It was the worst day of Annabel's life. There was no escape. Her eyes transposed one frightening image to replace it with another, and another, and another. Rocks around her transformed from black to green and red, floating even behind her closed eyelids. This was sheer terror, the scrabbling to find an exit, but knowing no exit was there. No exit, nothing but rock and stones, damp and cold. Oh, and that air so still, and that water so drip, drip, dripping. The stone had been rolled in front of Annabel, and no strength remained in her to deal with its removal. Perhaps the sweet relief of semi-consciousness would be gifted by a compassionate God, so she wouldn't die amidst awareness of her pain and fear. But it wasn't reaching her quickly enough, and she was beginning to panic. She must force herself to breathe more slowly and to conserve the air and to stave off suffocation. Annabel woke up sweating. That dream again. It had been 14 years ago now. Why so many dreams still? Why so much angst? Why such vivid memories? Annabel's husband, Tony, wondered more than most. She was driving him to distraction, as she woke screaming most nights, and he'd ask her, "Why can't you just get over it and move on?" That was what everyone else had done. Many people who were far less bright and far less insightful than Anna had managed to move on from events that were far worse. Annabel hadn't, or couldn't. She'd been in the Central Lake District when it happened, not so far from Keswick, a place she knew well and felt comfortable in when it came to walking. Annabel needed that comfort. Not particularly the physical comfort gained from luxury, but definitely the comfort brought by security, by practice, and by knowing exactly what was likely to happen next. If she was well prepared and if she was near to home in a much-loved location, then nothing could go wrong, whatever she did. How could it? She'd been preparing for days to enter this, her first ever cave. Tony had been with her, experienced and safety-minded, so of course nothing bad was going to happen. That just wasn't how these things worked. You know how it's said that people dream about events in order to get their subconscious to come to terms with the reality behind them? Well, Annabel wasn't sure that that was true. Surely she'd have worked through her issues by now. Wasn't 14 years long enough? Surely she'd have either worked through or blocked out all the horrors of the lakes by now. Surely. But when she allowed herself to truly remember, she knew. The truth was that nothing really could have prepared her for the experience, or help her afterwards when it came to dealing with the horrors she'd spent those minutes living, for real. First the panic, then fear, then unknowing terror and instability, then anticlimax. Nothing. That constriction, then immediate relaxation, had happened so quickly, as if some enormous inner bubble of panic popped inside her to leave a floating residual calm and acceptance. Even she could barely believe the change, the meditative calm. Her muscles tingled as they descended into it. The water gushed towards her. Initial panic over, she lay down. She willed her nostrils to close for a moment, while she allowed the water, freezing cold and fast as whitewater rapids, to cover her as she accepted her fate. I shall die, she thought, but what a way to go. She'd accomplished something impossible. She would have died having conquered fear and having accepted life and the underground earth. She was at one with the rock, at one with this water. The hysteria was a distant memory, and Annabel decided that she was ready to leave the earth, ready and happy and willing the water towards her. But that wasn't the way the water wanted it. First, the water covered her face. She imagined possibilities. First option, the water subsides. She lies shivering till she is helped up and out of the tunnels. After drying off and warming up, their small party would arrive at the pub, bravado-filled now, tired and euphoric. all relieved at the narrow escape. They'd be jovial, clay-covered and at ease. They'd walk straight to the toilets to clean up hands and face a little, and she'd look into the mirror on her way to the lounge. Her unintentionally face-packed skin would be fresher with fewer blemishes. Her previously dark-circled eyes would sparkle mischievously. She would have been cleansed by the clay. Her allergy to earthbound, surface-bound life would have been cured by her hours below. Or perhaps the very rocks and crystals would heal her temporarily. She'd eat with gusto and hear the caves once again calling her. Second option. The water rushes and puddles and covers her panicking form. She hits her head and subsides flat onto the bed of the passage, with pillowing gushes of water covering. Third, she'd move, she'd panic. She'd think of all she'd left undone, the bathroom tiles which needed replacing, the garden fence which needed painting, and the dinner party next week. She'd find herself a second wind and pull herself up from the corpse position and begin crawling to safety, crawling through the gushes towards the sound of her yelling Tony and their other friends. Go, Annabel, go. Fourth, well, that was it. The fourth wasn't easy. The fourth involved unselfishness and bravery that she'd always been loath to admit each person had a potential for. The fourth meant going back. Going back to the trapped, screaming others, whose terror she heard each and every night in each and every dream. She'd almost decided, almost got it into her head that fighting to save others was better than lying back to die. Either way she might perish, but surely it was better not to drag others with her through her own negligence. Annabel lifted her head above the water. That was it. She was nearly there. Just a few more inches, and she'd be free. Move your hand, Annabel. Move your knee, Annabel. Turn over, Annabel. Crawl, Annabel. Come to us, Annabel. Anna! 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 She tried, but the water was so fast, and she was scared. Death would be easier, but still the shouting pierced her head. The shouting came over and over. Some shouts were of support and instructions, but the ones she was listening to were asking for help, begging for help, and screaming for help over and over and over. And she moved, she turned, and despite the force of the water, she began to crawl towards the screams. Option 4 was by far the best option, so she continued. She was sure now that her wetsuit was seriously damaged. It wasn't built for this kind of crawling. She could barely breathe, and she could barely see, but she could hear. Oh, Lord, could she hear? Crawling further and further, hearing her name over and over. Annabel! And it stopped. Suddenly she was dragged under, struggling against the force of the water's restless hold. The air was knocked out of her lungs. Had she hurt herself? Had she banged her head? She was surely imagining the water carrying her backwards, carrying her and squeezing her. She coughed violently to release the water, and the voices came again. Annabel! She resisted being lifted to the surface. She'd shouted and had heard a voice say, poor Anna, who knew that she'd end up being claustrophobic? She wanted to refute it because she wasn't in the slightest. She wanted to go back to the voices. Exhausted yet nervy and panicked, she'd agreed to a mild sleeping tablet and had woken some hours later. Her bed at home, her husband concerned, her body adorned with cuts and bruises and scarred by its near-drowning experience. She tried to get to them, she told Tony. She tried, but the water pulled her back. They were shouting her. Tony comforted his wife. It was us calling you. It was me pulling you back. I grabbed you round the middle. I couldn't get you to understand. You were crawling the wrong way. We were behind you. We all were. Annabel smiled and tried her best to look sleepish. Pretended she realised how wrong she'd been, how she'd got it all wrong, how she'd obviously misheard the echoes. But she knew she hadn't. She knew she'd been called, and not by Tony and Ben and Colin and Sue. She'd heard lost voices, calling her deeper and deeper to the centre of the cold, dank rock, then deeper still to the heat and the hospitality of the underworld, to those screamers and shouters who wanted her and who knew her from times of old. That was why she knew that she could never be afraid of being underneath. in a place so familiar and comforting. Annabelle, they'd shouted, over and over and over, imploring her as the parents of a missing child might on national news. They weren't angry. They just wanted her back. Annabelle, they said, over and over in her dreamings, come home.